Good evening, all, and welcome back to Untold Fears. Tonight, we venture into the frozen heart of America's last frontier with 10 of the most disturbing true Alaskan ghost town horror stories. These are not mere folklore or legends whispered through generations. No, these are documented accounts drawn from police reports, personal journals, survivor testimonies, and government records that have languished in dusty archives for decades. From the creature-stalked ruins of Portlock, where an entire community fled in abject terror, to the permafrost graves of Kennot, where corporate secrets still lie frozen beneath the earth. Each story tonight uncovers a fragment of authentic horror that officials prayed would never surface. We'll delve into mining disasters deliberately concealed, government experiments that spiraled catastrophically out of control, and encounters with forces so malevolent they compelled entire populations to abandon everything they'd built in these remote settlements. If you're new here, be sure to subscribe to Untold Fears for daily true horror content that will leave you questioning what truly transpires when civilization collides with the untamed wilderness. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. And if you'd like to support my work in unearthing these buried tales, you can buy me a coffee via the link in the description. Now, let us journey into the permafrost-preserved nightmares of Alaska's abandoned ghost towns, where temperatures plummet below survival thresholds, and the truth is even colder. But remember, dear listeners, from every shadow emerges a light, a lesson, a blessing in disguise. As we explore these chilling accounts, we'll reflect on the resilience of the human spirit, and the wisdom gained from facing the unknown. Number 1. Portlock, the creature that drove a town away. Let's begin with Portlock, a once thriving cannery town on the southern tip of the Kenai Peninsula, established in the early 20th century as a hub for salmon processing and trade. Historically, the area was known to the local Alaskan people as a place of ancient warnings, with oral traditions, speaking of a hairy man or Nantinarch, a massive, elusive being said to roam the forests and steal away the unwary. Captain Nathaniel Portlock himself, the British explorer who named the bay in 1786, noted in his journals the eerie silence of the woods and the sense of being watched, though he attributed it to the harsh environment. By the 1940s, Portlock had grown into a bustling community of log cabins, a post office, and a cannery that employed dozens, but official records cite economic factors, like the construction of the Sterling Highway making other towns more accessible, as the reason for its gradual abandonment around 1950, with residents relocating to nearby native villages like Nanalk and Port Graham. I'm reading this from a journal I found in an estate sale in Anchorage. The seller said it belonged to her grandfather, Marcus Beaumont, one of the last residents of Portlock. She didn't want to talk about why she was selling his belongings. But when I opened the leather-bound book and saw the first entry dated March 15, 1949, I understood why she couldn't keep it in her house any longer. Marcus Beaumont had beautiful handwriting, the kind they taught in schools during the early 1900s. His entries started normal enough: complaints about the weather, notes about the salmon run, observations about his neighbors in what was then a thriving cannery town. But as I read deeper into the journal, the entries began to change. The handwriting became more hurried, more desperate, and the content became something that would haunt anyone who read it. The first unusual entry was dated April 2, 1949. Marcus wrote, "Something has been watching the town from the tree line for 3 days now. Old Peter Varsnikoff saw it first, standing maybe 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair just beyond the cannery. When Peter called out to it, the thing disappeared so fast it was like it had never been there at all. But Peter swears he saw those yellow eyes watching us, calculating something we would not want to understand. I have spent months researching the history of Portlock, and what I found in official records does not match what Marcus Beaumont documented in his journal. According to the government records, Portlock was abandoned gradually due to economic factors and the construction of the Stirling Highway, which made other communities more accessible. The post office closed between 1950 and 1951, and residents slowly moved to nearby native villages like Nanelk and Port Graham. But Marcus Beaumont's journal tells a different story entirely. April 8, 1949. Jimmy Hobson went hunting yesterday morning and has not returned. This would not be unusual except that Jimmy knows these woods better than anyone. He was tracking a moose along the creek bed behind the old Russian church ruins when his wife Mary heard him scream. Not a yell for help, but a scream of pure terror that echoed off the mountains for what seemed like minutes. When the search party found his rifle 2 days later, it was bent in half like someone had grabbed both ends and folded it like a piece of paper. There was no sign of Jimmy anywhere. The journal entries from April became increasingly frantic. Marcus documented 3 more disappearances in the span of 2 weeks. Each time the search parties would find evidence of a struggle, torn clothing, broken equipment, disturbed earth, but never a body. What they did find were tracks. April 20, 1949. The tracks are everywhere now. 18 inches long, deep impressions in the mud that show 5 toes and what looks like claws. Thomas Larson measured them and said, whatever made these tracks would have to weigh at least 600 pounds and walk upright like a man, but no man has feet that size, and no bear leaves tracks like these. The elders are calling it Nantinark, the old Alushik word for the hairy one that steals people. They say their grandparents talked about this thing. But I always thought those were just stories to keep children from wandering too far into the woods. What Marcus described in his journal matches accounts I found from other sources, but with details that never made it into any official reports. The creature that was terrorizing Portlock was not just taking people. It was studying them, learning their patterns, their routines, their weaknesses. April 25, 1949. Last night, something threw rocks at the Hendrickson house for over an hour. Not small stones, but boulders the size of watermelons that would crash into the walls and roof. When sunrise came and Emil Hendrickson went outside to investigate, he found the rocks arranged in a perfect circle around his house, like some kind of warning or territorial marking. But the most disturbing thing was what he found in the center of that circle. A pile of personal belongings from all the people who have disappeared. Jimmy Hobson's hunting knife. Sarah Nelson's hair ribbon. Frank Peterson's tobacco pouch. It was like the thing was collecting trophies and wanted us to know it. The journal entries from May 1949 showed a community in complete terror. People were afraid to leave their houses after dark, and even during the day, no one ventured into the woods alone. The cannery workers were refusing to go to the outlying fishing stations, and several families had already packed up and left town on the monthly supply boat. May 3, 1949. Albert Petka tried to fight it. Albert was a tough old Russian who had been in Portlock since the cannery first opened in 1921. When the thing came for his dogs, Albert went after it with an axe and a rifle. We heard the gunshots around midnight. Then Albert screaming, then nothing. In the morning, we found Albert in his yard with his chest caved in, but he was still breathing. He lived long enough to tell us what he had seen. He said it was not an animal, not exactly human either, but something in between. It walked on 2 legs like a man, but it was covered in coarse dark hair, and its face was wrong. Too long, too primitive, with teeth like a wolf. Albert said it moved faster than anything that size should be able to move, and it was smart. It had used his dogs as bait, knowing Albert would come out to protect them. After Albert Pete had died from his injuries, The remaining residents of Portlock held a meeting in the cannery foreman's office. According to Marcus' journal, there were only 23 adults left in town, plus a handful of children. The decision they made would effectively end Portlock as a community forever. May 10, 1949. We voted unanimously. Everyone leaves on the next supply boat, which should arrive within 2 weeks. Those who want to stay in Alaska will go to Port Graham or Seldovia. Others are talking about moving to Seattle or Vancouver, getting as far away from this place as possible. No one wants to say it out loud, but we are not just leaving because of the disappearances or even because of what happened to Albert. We are leaving because we know that whatever is out there in the woods is not going to stop until every one of us is gone. It has been picking us off one by one, learning from each attack, getting bolder and more aggressive. If we stay, we will all end up like Jimmy Hobson and the others, just names on a list of people who walked into the Alaskan wilderness and never came back. But the most disturbing entry in Marcus Beaumont's journal was not about the creature itself, but about what happened after the decision to abandon Portlock was made. May 15, 1949. The thing knows we are leaving. I do not know how it could possibly understand human speech or comprehend our intentions, but it does. Last night, it came right up to the edge of town and stood in the middle of Main Street. If you can call our little dirt road a street, Mrs. Davidson was looking out her window and said it just stood there for almost an hour, turning its head slowly to look at each house, like it was taking inventory. When the moon went behind a cloud and the street went dark, it disappeared. But this morning, we found something that chilled us all to the bone. Scratched into the dirt in front of every house was the same symbol, a circle with lines radiating out from the center like the sun. The elders say this is an old Alushic symbol that means watching or waiting. The thing was telling us that even after we leave, it will remember us. The final entries in Marcus Beaumont's journal were written aboard the supply boat that carried the last residents away from Portlock in late May 1949. His handwriting had returned to its careful, measured style, as if the act of leaving that cursed place had allowed him to regain some composure. May 28, 1949. As we sailed away from Port Chatham Bay, I looked back at Portlock one last time. The buildings were already starting to look abandoned, even though we had only left hours before. The forest seemed to be creeping closer to the houses, and I could swear I saw something large moving between the trees near the old Russian Orthodox church. Captain Morrison said he would make one more supply run to Portlock in 6 months to pick up anyone who might have returned or any salvageable equipment. I told him not to bother. Some places are meant to be forgotten, and some things are better left undisturbed. But Marcus Beaumont's journal did not end there. He made one final entry 6 months later, dated November 15, 1949. Captain Morrison went back to Portlock, despite my warnings. When his boat returned to Seldovia, he was white as a sheet and refused to talk about what he had found there. All he would say was that the town was different and that he would never set foot in Port Chatham Bay again. I convinced him to tell me what he had seen after several drinks at the Seldovia Inn. According to Captain Morrison, every building in Portlock had been systematically destroyed, not by weather or time, but torn apart by something with enormous strength. Roofs had been ripped off and thrown hundreds of yards into the forest. Walls had been punched through as if by giant fists. The cannery machinery, which weighed tons, had been overturned and scattered like toys. But the most disturbing thing was what Captain Morrison found in the center of what had been Main Street. The creature had built something there. A structure made from the debris of our houses arranged in a complex pattern that hurt his eyes to look at. In the center of this structure was a pile of bones. Human bones arranged in the same circular pattern we had found outside the Hendrickson house. Captain Morrison counted at least a dozen skulls. He believes that everyone who disappeared from Portlock during those final months was kept alive somewhere, kept as prisoners until we left town. Then the creature killed them all at once, using their remains to build some kind of monument or warning. Captain Morrison said he could feel something watching him from the forest while he was there, but he never saw what it was. He just knew that if he stayed any longer, he would never make it back to his boat. I closed Marcus Beaumont's journal and sat in silence for a long time, trying to process what I had read. The details were too specific, too consistent, and too terrifying to be the product of imagination or folklore. But more importantly, they explained why the official records about Portlock's abandonment were so vague and contradictory. Who would believe a story about an intelligent creature that systematically terrorized an entire community into abandoning their homes? How would government officials file reports about something that did not fit into any known category of animal or human threat? It was easier to blame economic factors and changing transportation patterns than to admit that an entire Alaskan town had been driven away by something that should not exist. But I could not stop thinking about Captain Morrison's final trip to Portlock and what he had found there. If Marcus Beaumont's account was accurate, then somewhere in the ruins of that abandoned cannery town was evidence of one of the most disturbing mass murders in American history. More than that, it suggested that the creature responsible was still out there, still waiting in the Alaskan wilderness. I decided to research what had happened to the other survivors from Portlock, the families who had fled to nearby villages in 1949. What I found was deeply troubling. Over the next decade, several of the Portlock survivors had died under mysterious circumstances. Some were reported as hunting accidents. Men found mauled by bears in areas where bears were not known to be aggressive. Others simply disappeared while fishing or traveling between villages. Their bodies never recovered. Marcus Beaumont himself had died in 1957 while visiting relatives in Port Graham. According to the death certificate, he had suffered a heart attack while walking alone near the beach. But his nephew later told investigators that Marcus' body showed signs of massive trauma, as if he had been struck by something with enormous force. The nephew also mentioned that Marcus had been acting strangely in the days before his death, claiming that something had been following him, watching him from the tree line. It is possible that Marcus Beaumont was simply a disturbed man who invented an elaborate story about monsters and disappearances. It is possible that the abandonment of Portlock was exactly what the official records claim, a gradual economic decline that led to residents relocating to more accessible communities. But as I held that leather journal in my hands, feeling the weight of all those careful entries and desperate observations, I could not shake the feeling that Marcus Beaumont had documented something real. Something that the authorities either could not or would not acknowledge. Somewhere in the abandoned ruins of Portlock, Alaska, the truth is still waiting to be discovered. And somewhere in the vast wilderness of the Kenai Peninsula, something that learned to hunt humans 75 years ago might still be watching, still waiting, still remembering the taste of terror from a town that no longer exists. The question that haunts me most is not whether Marcus Beaumont's story was true, but whether the creature he described ever left that abandoned cannery town, or whether it is still there, building monuments from the bones of anyone foolish enough to venture into its territory. Yet, from this tale of terror comes a blessing, a reminder to respect the unknown forces of nature and the ancient wisdom of indigenous peoples. In listening to the elders and heeding the signs, we can protect ourselves and honor the balance of the wilderness, turning fear into vigilance and survival. Number 2. Kennot, the Midnight Tunnel's Forgotten Miners. Next, we turn to Kennot, a historic copper mining town in the Wrangell St. Elias National Park, established in 1900 after the discovery of rich copper deposits by prospectors Jack Smith and Clarence Warner. The Kennot Mines Company, backed by investors like J.P. Morgan and the Guggenheim family, developed it into one of the most productive copper operations in the world, extracting over $200 million worth of ore between 1911 and 1938. The town, named after the misspelled version of explorer Robert Kennot, featured a mill town with bunkhouses, a hospital, and a recreation hall, but by 1938, depleting ore and falling prices led to its closure, leaving behind a well-preserved ghost town now a National Historic Landmark. The call came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. The woman on the line was sobbing. "My name is Sarah Mitchell," she said. "I need to tell someone what really happened to my great-uncle in Kennot before I lose my nerve." I had been documenting Alaskan ghost town stories for 3 years, but something about Sarah's voice made me sit up in bed and grab my recorder. There was a desperation there, a weight that suggested she had been carrying this burden for far too long. "Take your time," I told her, settling into my chair. "Tell me everything." Sarah's breathing steadied slightly. "My great-uncle was Thomas Mitchell. He worked for the Kennot Copper Corporation in the 1930s, right up until they closed the mine in 1938. But what I am about to tell you never made it into any official records. The company made sure of that." She paused and I could hear her turning pages. "I found his journal 3 months ago when we were cleaning out my grandmother's attic. She died at 96. And right before the end, she grabbed my hand and said, 'Sarah, find Tommy's journal. Tell them what really happened to those boys.' I had no idea what she meant until I started reading. The journal, according to Sarah, began normally enough. Thomas Mitchell had arrived in Kennot in 1935, working as a tunnel foreman in the Bonanza mine. The copper operation was already winding down, but there was still work to be done extracting ore and maintaining tunnels. The first strange entry is from October 15, 1935. Sarah continued, her voice growing steadier as she found her rhythm. "Uncle Tommy wrote about a new shaft they had opened on the north side of the mountain. He called it the Midnight Tunnel because they only worked it during night shifts. The daytime crews refused to go near it." According to Thomas's journal, the Midnight Tunnel had been discovered when a dynamite blast had opened up a natural cavern system that extended deep into the mountain. The copper deposits there were richer than anything they had found before. But there was something else. The cavern had clearly been worked before, not by modern mining equipment, but by hand tools. Old hand tools. Uncle Tommy wrote that they found mining equipment down there that looked like it came from the 1880s, maybe earlier. Pickaxes, shovels, lanterns. But here is the strange part. There were no records of any mining operation in that area before Kennot arrived. The company had purchased the land directly from the government, and there were no previous claims on file. Thomas's journal described how the night shift workers began reporting strange sounds echoing from the deeper parts of the Midnight Tunnel, tapping sounds like someone working with a pickaxe. Sometimes they would hear voices, but when they investigated, they would find the tunnels empty except for the old mining equipment scattered around as if it had just been used. The company brought in investigators, Sarah said. Uncle Tommy wrote that they were not regular mining inspectors. These men wore suits and carried briefcases, and they spent 3 days down in the Midnight Tunnel with measuring equipment and cameras. After they left, the company issued new orders. The Midnight Tunnel was to be sealed immediately, no explanations given. But Thomas Mitchell was curious. On the night before the tunnel was to be permanently closed, he made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He went down into the Midnight Tunnel alone. Sarah's voice dropped to almost a whisper as she read from the journal entry dated November 3, 1935.